we've got plenty of time to work with you folks. I think what I'd suggest is that since this this is our only panel for the day, we would might approach our questions to them as we would in a round table. We've heard several suggestions about integrating ethics into the practice of neuroscience, whether it's at the bench through consultation or through embedded experts and protocols, bringing researchers together in consortia. We heard establishing focused centers to address integration. You know our task, and we'd like you to help us with your top thoughts, your priorities, if you will. What would you say is this is a repeat of the question we asked our panelists yesterday. What is the single most important initiative or step that we as a commission can recommend for effectively integrating ethics into the practice of neuroscience? Why don't we just run down the table? And Pamela, we'll start with you.
The single most.
You want to take a pass?
I'm going to pass on this
Okay,
one.
well, but we're going to come back to you.
You're going to come back to me.
Barbara.
Thank you. Well, I think I stated it at the end of my comments. We have built research, and there will continue to be research, but I think unless there is effective feedback, and I know you alluded to this yesterday when you were talking about ELSI and the problems of siloing, and having standalone centers is not siloing. It is, and it does elevate the inquiry in a way that would not happen if there were not national centers directed to it. So that is a method, but the structural integration through which the research gets and the policy work gets integrated is something that the research community can't really produce on its own. So I think there has to be both. I think there has to be a structural mechanism whereby the societal implications work can be integrated into the enterprise.
Okay, so actually I heard two things from you. One is to go ahead and have centers who focus on these issues, but also to have mechanisms to bridge those back to the bench.
Yeah, I smuggled too.
Yeah, you did. That's okay. Pamela's having trouble with the first one. We'll come back.
Well, I think it would be really useful if the commission could even in just stressing that it's a need to have integration of any sort would be, I think, even a step forward from where we are, because, as you know, I think there's just a reluctance to unsilo.
So to build the case, present the case, and
Yes.
insist on it.
Yes, and also that in order for existing policies to work, that were generated in sort of the more top-down type of approaches, they can't really work alone, and they require this integration. And so there's this sort of dependence relationship that hasn't addressed the back end.
Good point. As Eric pointed out, it seems to be a learned dependence, though.
Yes.
G-
Can I make two?
Please, but only if you push your button.
Okay, it's a deal.
Okay, good.
I would say that regardless of what you end up recommending, that you frame it in a way that is sensitive to and appealing to the climate that you've heard discussed so many times by members who've testified today and yesterday. The climate of research that is, I think, for some good reasons, skeptical of interventions. It's a tradition in science, and it's not going away. So, whatever you recommend, I think it needs to take that into account, ideally in a way that's inviting or challenging. And then the other recommendation I would make or point would be that, as the Commission has already suggested, that you recommend a diversity of approaches. Don't insist on one mechanism, and allow these to be taken up and experimented with and organically evolve.
We'll come back to that one, I think. Pamela, I'm going,
Yes, now I can answer, because I hesitated, because what I want to say is so fundamental that I can't imagine you'd actually put this in the report. But I think that science education has to be fundamentally restructured from the get-go. And that is what is ultimately going to address these issues. And I think that scientists think the way they think because their education leads them to think that way. They're siloed because that's how they're trained. It should be no surprise that they exist within a particular world when that is how science education is organized. And I think that that is something that has to be dealt with, not just because of the advances in neuroscience, but the advances in science across the board. And nanotechnology, genomics, all of these things are raising such fundamental, essentially life-threatening, globally threatening, and also promising issues that the day has passed where we can have commissions or consortia and actually feel like we're fundamentally dealing with it.
I think that blends well with what Mildred was saying. Nita? And then I've got Dan and Chris.
I heard Jim use a phrase which I thought was really helpful, building the case, and trying to underscore what you all have said. And Eric had a quote up on one of his slides where a scientist said something like, but why should I want to talk to the public? And it seems to me like those two things go hand in hand, which is we have to build the case in order to be able to fundamentally restructure science and education. So I think it's clear that ethics integration is essential, but how do we get there for building the case? What do you think the best arguments are for building the case in order to fundamentally restructure science education, in order to provide what I think is really essential is the ethical rationale to transition from where we are today to a model of ethics integration?
Any of you? Sure.
I think that one of the things that we've found is, and I think Eric's work really supports this, is that a lot of the most interesting motivations end up coming from the scientists themselves. And working, for instance, Mildred Cho and I work with the Human Microbiome Project, and what's been fascinating with that group is that when you bring together people trained in ecology to people working in clinical sciences, the ecologists are able to formulate arguments about the fundamental importance of ethics in a way that's so different from the clinicians, and the clinicians back to the ecologists, that they come up themselves with the justifications for how these things should happen. And so I think that there really is a sort of synergy that can happen, that they can create the justifications because they see the flaws and the reasonings and the dangers and the excitement or the potential benefits in each other's work.
Others to that response? Yeah. Or to that question?
I would agree that motivation tends to come from the scientists. One of the interesting contrasts, one of the few contrasts, I think, between the consultation model and the embedded humanist model is, as we were discussing before the panel, for consultation that's initiated by the scientists, for the embedded experience that's initiated by the social scientist humanist. However, it's interesting that the very first pilot study in the STIR project was an invitation from the lab director to me to spend time in his lab. So I think that's a powerful engine to tap into. I'm a little concerned about using approaches that are fear-based, which I think have been suggested in the past to motivate ethical behavior. I'm also aware of sort of institutional attempts to frame scientific responsibility as, we've got this covered, everything should, rest assured, don't worry. That might be good in terms of, maintaining social calm and order, but I don't think it taps into the powerful creativity, motivations, and insights that are really needed to drive this forward. So one way to, it's hard to really give you a direct answer, but one way to frame this would be in terms of an invitation to conduct an experiment. Let's see what we can do to close this gap. All right. If you can get buy-in on any level, that, well, we should do more, or there, we might need to look into this. And then the second step is to say, well, we really admit that we don't have mechanisms. Admit ignorance. Ignorance is a resource for invention. I think those are two powerful first steps. And then the third can be the pursuit and invention of mechanisms.
thanks for giving us some good examples about integration, which I very much think is a positive step forward and a way to proceed. And I think we're, as a commission, probably very enthusiastic about it. But I wondered if you, nothing is perfect, right? And I was wondering whether you would help reflect with us on what you see are potential downsides to this method. And in particular, the question of whether too much integration, cooperation leads to losing one's critical edge and becoming sort of co-opted, right? If you're the integrated ethicist at Myriad Genetics, you're not going to be against gene patenting, for instance. So that's a potential downside, and I wonder if you could reflect for us on how to guard against being co-opted as we move toward an integrated, cooperative model.
Dan, in addition, your question fits so well one we have from the audience. May I blend those two together and make sure we get them answered? Peggy Mason is a professor at the University of Chicago.
Which happens also to be
Oh,
from,
Peggy.
from the
Welcome.
University of Chicago.
I can't believe I looked at Peggy. Welcome back, Peggy. And she also is cautioning, and so that's why I thought we'd put Peggy's question in here. I'm alarmed by the idea of ethical pre-screening. The idea that some science is wise and some is not forms a slippery slope toward thought police even. All scientific questions should be asked, she says, as long as the execution is ethical, the plan is rigorous, and the question of fundamental interest. Then the work is valuable. So in sum, she says, I agree with the researchers' views that alarmed Dr. Cho. The most exciting scientific progress will require open intellectual inquiry, curiosity that is not constrained by someone else's view of the greater good. So constraint is one of the concerns of the negative. So can we throw the negative and the co-opt question, being co-opted, out to the panel? Who wants to start?
I'll take a stab here. So at CNS UCSB, we've used a different and I would say complementary model to the one at ASU, which is that instead of embedding social scientists and humanists into the research enterprise, we have embedded nanoscale science and engineering students into the social science enterprise. So we have material scientists traveling to China to interview, to co-interview industry developers, government laboratory people. And so what that does is engage them about a wider issue about what is beyond the bench. And a lot of them already have questions and doubts about their commitment to the bench. And we have found that we actually get a crop of very, very top students who are interested in this, and which also speaks to Eric's point about voluntary. You cannot mandate this. This has to be there. But I would say from our experience, we have run this as an experiment for 8.5 years now. And the people who show up, who want to do this, and whose advisors are supportive because they continue their bench science as on track. And so this is something they do in addition. This is not something if you put the resources there and you have a context in which it can take place, this is not hard work. This is really a pleasure.
Mildred, yes, I would hope to hear from you.
I'll try to take on both of those topics. The co-opting issue, I think, is a very important one. And we've considered that in the setting of research ethics consultation, which started out as an institutional phenomenon. So one of the reasons why we have been wanting to try to do this at sort of national collaborative level is to take it out of individual institutions to mitigate what would be a conflict of interest, basically, especially when consulting for your own researchers. So that was part of that motivation. And then this sort of concern about constraint. I sympathize with that concern, but I would also argue that there isn't really such a thing as open, free science without constraints. There's all kinds of constraints on science. It's where the funding comes from, where it doesn't come from, all sorts of things. So I think I wouldn't look at it as a constraint, but as a sort of taking into consideration a larger framework and framing of scientific questions. So maybe considering that the way that you as an individual scientist are seeing the purpose of a study may not be given the same priority as other stakeholder communities.
I think, as I understand the constraint question, it's more about at the genesis, at coming up with an idea, the concern, or let me not do concern, the notion that there is something pure about curiosity that could be blunted by imagining that even my curiosity to discover more is somehow going to be regulated by any sort of whether it's ethics, an ethics team in pre-screening, or some other purpose. I think many academics, or some other entity. I think for academics, that's a concern about the freedoms they have to imagine where they want to take the research. Again, this may be back to building the case and making the point that these things should work in synergy as opposed to being regulatory. But it sounds like Amy's got a thought on that.
Well, I think following up on that, I think that is building the case for the integration of ethics and science, because fundamental to building the case is understanding that being an ethical scientist doesn't mean that ethics is all about constraining what you do. Ethics is about understanding. So let's begin with the fundamental ethical issue of neuroscience, as I understand it. It's understanding that neuroscience, that the enterprise of neuroscience has a social meaning and social purpose, that neuroscientists, as scientists, are contributing to the public good in a way. That's an ethical statement. It's not a scientific statement, it's an ethical statement, but it's an ethical statement about neuroscience. Now, if that's true, if the reason we are commissioned as a bioethics commission to speak on the ethics in and of neuroscience is because there's a public good here, there are multiple public goods, then understanding why ethics and neuroscience need to be integrated is understanding neuroscience to begin with. It's understanding the part that isn't narrowly scientific that propels President Obama to have a national initiative called the BRAIN Initiative. And I think if we can begin there and make the case, as Nita said, we will at least win half the battle. The other half of the battle, I think, as Raju said, is coming up with an understanding of what models can work. Not a single model, unless you think of it as, if you can think of a model that's a model of model, that's a pluralistic one, you might say any model that works is going to have to be capacious in the different ways in which you integrate. Because as I would like to, and I was talking to our executive director yesterday, I'd like to write a co-author an article on this about bioethics and neuroscience, never too early or too late, right? It's never too early to learn why it's important, and it's the case, that everything that's good science is good ethics, has good ethics integrated. And it's never too late to have a consultation about a complex project that you're engaged in. So I think this is, for those of us, for people like me who've taught ethics and public policy and science and ethics, it seems so fundamental, but there are so many misconceptions out there, as you could see by your quotes, by very highly educated, excellent people in both ethics and science.
I think we can talk about this one for quite a while. Oh, Eric would like to, as a matter of fact. Go ahead.
If I could sort of offer some remarks that dovetail with the last comments and also respond to the question that's still on the table, I believe. So in response to this idea of constraining the science, I think that as the chair has suggested, it's possible to unpack the embedded values that are already part of the enterprise. Now, of course, logically, that makes perfect sense. Of course, the difficulty is that socially, these values might have simply been promised by scientists who are seeking funding. However, this is the gap. This is the exciting gap. How to bridge it? And I think by asking fundamental questions: why are you doing this? Why do you think your lab director wants to get this grant in particular? Why does your institution promote it in this way? Why did the funding agency write the solicitation in the following way? By asking these questions, you can really unpack what's already there, and in the process, the scientists can take ownership, rather than the moral expert insisting on what the logical case is. I think it's a subtle move, but it allows for a co-responsible approach. So yeah, I agree that we don't want to unnecessarily constrain scientific creativity, and I would suggest that the word curiosity, which has been used a few times, is potentially an engine for both ethical care and scientific creativity. Co-optation was a concern. I think that's a very real concern. Maintaining a critical edge, avoiding conflicts of interest. That's one reason that I think, whether it's a consultation or embedded or another model, it's important that there's an end to the interactions, and that the interactions aren't permanently housed in some sort of officer-type capacity, which would sort of take the excitement out of them. I think it's also important for there to be a community, so that the interacting social scientist or ethicist can come back to his or her critical community and reflect on what's going on, particularly if there's a number of people who are doing this at the same time. And obviously there are networks in both of our areas that are emerging to try to maintain that community. And I think maybe the last point I'll make is that there's another concern I have, and that is advocacy. Both sort of unwarranted advocacy and also the perception of advocacy. And so that's partly a barrier to entry, but it's also a potential abuse of authority. And so I think the burden, I don't think there's any question that the science won't be slowed down. I think we know that. But what about the social science? There's a way in which the social scientist has to constrain him or herself. And on some level, this is sort of rearguard action. I don't know that it's front and center to what the Commission's concerns are now. But if you're successful, you don't want to set up a situation in which scientists are sort of running for cover because they feel that they're going to be judged and they have no mechanism to argue back or to maintain. So I would put advocacy as a third sort of concern.
No, I appreciate that. I do want to move to our next question, but I think we need to face the fact that in this room with this crowd, ethics is so much into our forebrains that it may be difficult for us to understand, and we need to pay attention to an audience, a scientific audience, that we hope to help improve the quality of their science, that there is a notion that knowledge in and of itself is amoral. But how we pursue knowledge and how we use knowledge is where ethics needs to be applied. And the hop, skip, and a jump from saying knowledge is amoral, that's a freeing thought. The notion that we are going to be bound somehow, I think, for a particular audience is something we need to be sensitive to as we advance and, as I say, make the case that we're actually helping to amplify and in some ways not necessarily slow down, actually accelerate the value of knowledge that is obtained by ethical means for ethical purposes. Christine, you're next on my list.
So I have
First, I want to thank everybody for being here and for your comments. I have a very specific question, but I want to respond to this issue that has just been discussed, because I think perhaps it is a matter of framing a little bit. I mean, I understood your question, Jim, to be, in reiterating Peggy's question, constraint and pre-screening. And I've never heard anybody say pre-screening. I think pre-screening is the wrong notion of what we're talking about. And so we have to be really careful about how we think about and talk about what's happening. Absolutely. And along that line, I've noticed in several of the presentations, not an absence of the word ethics, but a move towards genomics and society and science and society, and, you know, characterizing these activities without using the word ethics. And I don't know if that's, I'd love to hear whether that's an intentional move or, you know, just sort of how things are evolving, but I'd love to hear some thoughts on that. But my specific question has to go with funding. I heard, you know, setting aside 3 to 5% was a move that was sort of off the cuff, but allowed for ELSI. We wouldn't have done it without the funding. Mildred said 24% of the CTSA Research Ethics Council services have no funding at all. The projects that you both described sound like they're NSF grants that are renewable, or hopefully. I mean, I don't know. I mean, so if we're going to say, I mean, and obviously none of this can happen without funding, right? So if we're going to say anything about funding, what should we say? So those are my two easy questions.
Please, Eric, and then Barbara.
I think it is a conscious choice to use the word society or socioethics or societal and ethical issues, and that's perhaps a meta-ethical decision. It's a recognition that there are pluralistic ethical frameworks and values, and that the last thing we want to do is have the very first conversation be an argument about which ethical framework. Yeah.
Barbara had a comment, and then Peggy. I'm Pam, rather. Peggy.
So, yes, what he said. So,
Okay, Pam.
so really, it's more a move to see ethical frameworks as values, and I think we tend to use value language more than ethics values, and particularly in the international context where the cross-cultural values that pertain are not necessarily all coming out of the Western philosophical tradition. It's a particularly critical issue. We also, because part of what we are doing is trying to understand without preconception what all the different stakeholders in the enterprise have as their conceptions about ethical practices, we are open about that, and we actually see that as part of the benefit of having an enterprise like this is that you can operate from empirical data on that rather than intuitions. And the intuitions that a lot of the people involved in the enterprise have don't necessarily align with the empirical data that we collect. And the funding, NSF funds national centers for a 10-year horizon. So we are approaching sunset, and we are thinking about what comes next. And as a director, I would say one of the reasons I would come here and talk is that I think we really are looking to pass the baton, if that's the time we would like. We've built up this whole body of work, and we would like to find a way to maintain it and convey it to the next generation of researchers in neuro, in synthetic biology, and the other emerging technology realm. Thank you.
Well, I'll start backwards because I was going to address that at the end, but now that you've raised it, I think it's important that the funding come from the government agencies that are funding the science. And although there might have been something a little uncomfortable about putting ELSI directly in NHGRI, I still think that the responsibility lies with the organizations that are funding the science. And just to follow up on the comment that you're going to sunset at 10 years, because I know Mildred's program is also going to sunset at 10 years, which is funded through the NHGRI. And it's very interesting because the genome centers that have been funded on 5-year cycles aren't sunsetting. The ethics are sunsetting, right? And so the question is, really, why is it treated differently? Now, there are practical issues and there's budgetary issues, and I understand that. But I think that it's something to look at, that why is it that certain kinds of things should presumably take on their own institutional, I mean, the idea is that the activities that they've encouraged through the SEER programs at NHGRI should now be supported by the institutions, which I think is a good idea, but then arguably you could say that about the science as well. I do think that one of the things that circles through this in terms of people not using the word ethics is when you use the word ethics, we find that they assume you mean informed consent. And so we don't use the word ethics at all. I mean, I don't when I talk to people. But I think that that speaks to a broader issue, which circles back to the comment I wanted to make in the first place, which is that the reframing is not simply a rhetorical strategy. I also think that understanding that social responsibility is not just a phrase, but it's a concept that needs to be made robust. It needs to be understood. It needs to be detailed. It needs to be operationalized. And it is not at this point. Social responsibility, although I think people think seriously and take it seriously, is in many ways a phrase. You try to look for a definition of social responsibility of science, and you will not find very many. And I think that that's important, and I think it's particularly important when you get in these arguments about scientific freedom versus social responsibility. I think I would hope that eventually that becomes a false distinction. And I think that the idea of scientific freedom is very often thrown up in the face of social responsibility. And the problem is because it's such a easily collapsible and easily fought against concept, social responsibility, that somehow it's constraining your curiosity. There's no traction there to make the argument back. And the point would be, there's never pure science. There's never pure knowledge. There's always a reason that you've done what you've done. And the point is that if you're training people to integrate social responsibility from the beginning, then what they're pursuing is going to be something that serves the common good. And I think that is very idealistic, I know, but I think that's the direction that this should be going.
Well, we might get some arguments on the purity of knowledge. But I think your observation of the different times that ethics programs are sunsetting from their science, associated science, makes the case that we're not yet fully integrated, right? Anita.
Wow, this has been such a rich conversation, and a lot of what I believe has been well stated by Dr. Cho and Dr. Gutman and others about the relationship between science and ethics. So I just want to say something which kind of may sound like a manifesto or something, but then I want to specifically address something that Dr. Sankar said. So I guess the manifesto thing I want to say is that, it seems to me that the enterprise of normative ethics applies to all human activities equally, including science. And the notion that we heard from Dr. Peggy, I've forgotten your last name. Mason. Thank you, Dr. Mason. That all questions should be asked. I mean, I agree with that, but to say that all questions should be asked does not entail that all questions should be scientifically researched in every context, without regard to consequences, or without regard to funding sources. And similarly, valuing the free play of ideas, which I do passionately, does not entail that no researcher is ethically responsible for the questions asked or the issues raised by his or her research, or that scientists have no obligation to speak out about misuses and misinterpretations of their research. So, having strong libertarian values about ideas and thinking and expression takes us not all the way toward the answering the question, what kinds of reasonable ethical constraints must there be? And those constraints, need not be in the form of pre-screening or anything even close to that, but just recognizing that there are going to be some limitations on science, as there are limitations on every human activity that we might engage in. So this manifesto comment relates somewhat to what I want to say to Dr. Sankar, which is I really loved your historical memory of what happened with ELSI in the context of genetics, because I was actually a member of the National Advisory Committee for Human Genome Research way back in the early 90s and mid-90s, and I was, as one of the few humanists on that committee, was the liaison between the advisory group and the DOE NIH ELSI working group. And one of the reasons why that group did not work, and I think you're right, it didn't work, was because that group of ELSI people, lawyers, social scientists, ethicists, wanted more of scientists, and more of the government than they were willing to deliver. And just one example, the ELSI working group wanted the scientific community whose research was being funded by the federal government to say something about the terrible problem of misunderstanding of what genetics was teaching us about intelligence and race. And the scientists did not want to touch that issue. The government didn't want to touch that issue. And yet it was one of the main ELSI problems that the ELSI working group saw as being a product of the emphasis on human genome research and human genome discoveries. So that kind of timidity, I think, is a problem. And the ELSI working group, as you say, had no bureaucratic home. They were powerless to do anything about what they thought were important things to do. That said, I want to praise that working group for its being out in the forefront of the question of insurance discrimination, because when the BRCA discoveries were made, that was a group that convened a conference to discuss what should be the limits on insurance companies' use of genetic information. That was a very productive meeting, which years later, led to the GINA statute being enacted. And also, I think that group was did a good thing in raising the problem of how do we use genetic information. So applied to neuroscience, I hope that the scientists and the government will not be overly timid in allowing us to have a conversation about the hard questions that will arise from what we learn about brains. And if we find brain differences between men and women, or this group or that group, will we have the courage to talk about that and to deal with that as a nation?
More of a statement, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I said so.
Raju, I have you next.
Thank you very much. I have a pragmatic question. But to lead to the question, listening to you, four of you making the presentations, I sort of classify them into two different approaches. One approach is to the top-down approach, whether the NIH or the NSF would say that we would support these programs and give support to people, and they would go and investigate and then try to publish papers and so on. And the second approach that Mildred and Eric talked about, are bottom-up approach, locally trying to develop programs and try to help investigators and trying to integrate that. And we heard good and bad about all of those different things. But here, just now, the goal of this effort is to try to, bring ethics to neuroscience. And the neuroscience community is very large. The annual neuroscience meeting attracts more than 20,000 people to come, and that's probably half of the investigators in this country, or even less. So it's a very large community. So the goal is to try to reach, these 50,000 or 75,000, investigators, students, and so on and so forth. So I think, Pamela suggested one approach would be to try to educate, everybody. And long term, I think, incorporating, these ethical principles into educational programs and so on and so forth would yield benefits, in the future. But we have an issue today. How do we reach this very large group of individuals and community? And obviously, what the Presidential Commission does addresses the issue, but I don't know how many people read, Presidential Commission reports. What are your ideas? How do you think that we should or should try to reach this very large population of scientists and get them into the fold?
I think other people have said today that, which is true, is that it has to be multiple approaches. There is no single approach. I know that one of the things that has influenced people beyond the ELSI community in terms of reaching out to genomics people is embedding the request for ethics within funding proposals. And so if the genomics people want research, they have to have an ethics piece. Now, there's many reasons for this has not always worked very well, but it is certainly a way to reach out beyond the ELSI community itself, because what that leads the scientists to do then is to find people in their universities or close by that they can collaborate with, and it leads to some very interesting interactions. So I think you have to think of, there is the education piece, and I think then you have to think of what are a combination of strategies that you're going to use to sort of get this message out, and one certainly would be through funding strategies.
I completely agree with that. And to somewhat get back to the question that Chris raised about the funding, I think it is important that the funding for ethics be in some way, maybe not necessarily dependent on the funding for the science parts, but I do think that what you said is important in terms of making it be part of the science to think about the ethics as opposed to having them separate. And I think that can be done through the funding. Of course, that does lead to potential co-opting issues and so forth. But I do think that having the support be seen as coming from the agencies that fund the science elevates it in a way that's very important institutionally, and as well as through other sort of linchpins in the scientific process, such as journals and through journal editors and so forth. And another way that neuroscientists might be engaged specifically is through their very large professional societies, and I know that there are some people trying to do that from within those professional groups, but that's another way that the genomics community has, for example, tried to do some of that.
Oh, no, I think this is very helpful, and I think we have to be both theoretically grounded and practically astute. And so it is true that the potential for co-optation is there when ethics is integrated. But the alternative is having ethics totally unintegrated. So there are going to be philosophers and theologians of bioethics who can work without grants, sitting and doing really important and interesting work without government funding. But if we want, as we do, and we've been charged to have the vast neuroscience community take the ethics of their profession seriously, then it seems to me that requiring at least large grants to neuroscientists that are collaborative in nature, which most of them are, ensure the ethics of what they're doing is a way of incentivizing both those working in ethics and those working in neuroscience to come together and address real issues. Why is this important, not only for science generally, but for neuroscience, as we'll talk about in the next session when we talk about a preliminary report? It is hard to find in the vast array of neuroscience research that doesn't raise really important ethical issues. It's just the nature of working in the area of the human brain and human neurology that raises a lot of ethical issues. So I think this is an important and productive way forward.
So my question to you is really one of approach. Typically, I think historically, ethics training evokes responses in those that are taking that training, and it's not necessarily a positive response because it's essentially an approach for risk mitigation. You need to take this training because we tell you you have to. That never works well. Or because if you don't know this body of evidence, something bad could happen to you. I mean, this is just things that humans don't like to hear. How do we approach research integration with ethics as an opportunity for research scientists versus risk mitigation? And for funders, how do you approach the implication that this is really a requirement versus integration really does strengthen the research enterprise? It finds efficiencies in the process by its very nature developing an interdisciplinary approach, which I think greatly strengthens science. If I'm a researcher and you lead me to understand that by having a research consultation, I am going to be talking not just to ethicists, but I will be thinking about novel ways that there may be second or third order effects of my work. Not, again, for risk mitigation, but there may be implications that have societal implications. And this could allow me to think of a novel synthesis that gives me a novel approach that will ask questions that funders will be interested in. And therefore, I'm putting myself in a more competitive position. I think that if we take that kind of approach, you're going to have a lot better uptake than to say, you need to take this body of work because it's a requirement, it's a duty. And two, that it will keep you out of trouble.
You know, if you don't mind, I'm going to do the same thing that I did to Dan, because we have a question that I think amplifies what you're saying. Lyric Jorgensen out there? Well, the question, though, is just like it's your point. Many panelists have suggested there is value in adding an ethicist to research team. Could you describe some of the principles or guidelines for determining when this sort of addition is value added? And I think that's what you're talking about. It also, and it goes on really to ask your question again. So what about that point? How do we, again, almost making the case for how is it that this is not rejected as something that is supposed to keep us out of trouble, but rather, or at least in addition, to help increase the value of the work we want to do. Fair?
It's a wonderful question, and I want to spin off of what I think the previous round of discussions alluded to, and that is the funding mechanisms at the research solicitation level. So there are obviously a number of targets and challenges, but assuming that there is buy-in by the agency, and assuming that there's a multi-pronged approach where there's certainly formal education, but then there's also this sort of research in motion with ethics idea. I think it's very important to have program officers and their reviewing panels have discussions about why we're doing this. Because otherwise, no matter how well stated the language is in the formal proposals, it'll just be ignored. So I really, and how do you have those discussions? Where do you have those discussions? There's multiple fora for that. But I think if those who are championing this issue are at least aware of that potential bottleneck, they can creatively address it.
I think that one of the ways to think about this is to move away from an RCR concept, which tends to be rules and checklists, and move toward social responsibility, which is a much more positive engagement, and it's what we can do to make the science better. It's not, what do I have to do to not get in trouble?
With that, Pamela, that's our final word to all of you. Thank you so much for your contributions this morning.